Welcome to Paris. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield, and I'm going to be moderating two expert panels this evening. I'm very honored to be asked to perform that role, and I'll do my best. Can everyone hear me clearly? We all have microphones, and I want to make sure that you can hear our experts. The first panel this evening is going to talk about the nuclear negotiations that are ongoing between the P5+1 and Iran, which is a big story, obviously, and we are very fortunate to have here tonight a wide, diverse set of expertise and perspectives. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to reflect to speak off the cuff about their perspectives and what they think is relevant about the Iran nuclear negotiations. For 5, 6, 7 minutes, relax and give us your view. And we have plenty of time. And as we get through the panel, we will then allow cross-discussion, and then we will invite questions from you, and hopefully brief comments, but not long speeches. We're going to start from my right with Olli Heinonen, the former Director General of the IAEA and a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government's Belfor Center for Science and International Affairs. Will be followed by Alireza Jafarzadeh, the Deputy Director of the NCRI U.S. Representative Office, the author of the book, The Iran Threat, President Ahmadinejad and the Coming Nuclear Crisis, and someone who had a lot to do with letting the world know that there was a nuclear program to be concerned about. We are then going to turn to the gentleman to my direct right, the Honorable James Woolsey, the former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the DCI. Were you DCI, or did they change? Yes, that was when the agency was the agency, right? That's right. And then we will have Ms. Linda Chavez, the former assistant to the U.S. President for Public Liaison, a commentator and columnist. You all know Linda. And finally, but last but not least, Mr. Bruno Tertrais, the senior fellow at the French Foundation for Strategic Research, FRS, and former special advisor to the Director of Strategic Affairs of the Ministry of Defense. So thank you all for joining me tonight. And with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Heinonen to offer some perspectives to get us started.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the organizers inviting me to talk here and share my views with you. And I'm actually looking at, interaction with the great audience which is here today. So I'm not going to be very, dogmatic in my presentation, but maybe 3, 4, 5 points where we stand today. First of all, when we look the 2nd of April agreement in Lausanne, actually I was happily in the other town for another reason at that night. And when I look at actually what this agreement more or less agrees between P5+1, that Iran will stay as a nuclear weapons threshold state for a number of reasons. There will be 5,000 centrifuges in Natanz, another 1,000 being used for other purposes in Fordo, but staying in dormant, which in practice means when you look at the infrastructure, the nuclear infrastructure in Iran, there's no real, in my view, dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. It stays as it is. It has not changed the course. With those 6,000 centrifuges, even feeding with the natural uranium in, whatever engineered barriers you put there, they are able to produce in at least 1 year's time, maybe slightly less time, enough material for one nuclear device. 25 kilograms of high-enriched uranium with U-235 in. So that's where we are. 1 year time with a certain assumptions. One assumption is that there's no clandestine or undeclared facility somewhere else. There's no clandestine nuclear material somewhere else. So in reality, if you look then how to monitor this system, you need to have a very robust system in place to make sure that there are no clandestine activities, no clandestine nuclear material anywhere, because if those exist, this time clock goes down to much less numbers than 1 year. And this is going to be a tremendous challenge, how to organize it from the verification point of view. IAEA access rights, you have heard, anytime, any place. This is still, I think, necessary to verify this undertaking, because so many centrifuges will stay there. Had it been 3,000, 2,000, that's fine. You probably could have had some other arrangements. And then when you come to the clandestine part, I think one of the most important things is actually to look at the history. The history, and the first question for me as a simple chemist from Brookline, Massachusetts, comes to my mind is that how many centrifuges actually Iran has? Is it those 5,000, 6,000 which remain there? The other ones goes to the stock over there under the IAEA control. But are these all? How many centrifuges Iran has actually produced in total, historically? And this is a very difficult undertaking, but I think that the provisions of this agreement need to include that access to the IAEA, that it can verify with a certain precision and uncertainty how many centrifuges Iran has produced historically. This was done in 2003. It was a hard job. Today's world, since Iran has by now produced more than 25,000, it's going to be more than difficult, but this needs to be in the undertaking. Otherwise, I don't think you can have a very credible verification scheme in place. Then, people talk about the possible military dimension. I think when you set a baseline for your verification scheme, there's one thing to look nuclear material, one thing to look enrichment capabilities, but at the very end, in order to have a complete picture, because all those other ones which I said, they come with their uncertainties. You know certain things, but you never can provide 100% assurances, as the former director of CIA can certainly confirm much better than me. Then you need to go to this other part and the nuclear weapons related aspirations which Iran might have had. One has to understand how far these experiments went. Were they just a screwdriver turn away from the nuclear explosive capacity? Or is it more? It's important for the verification. It's important in setting this baseline, not only with the nuclear material inventories, number of centrifuges, but also this part. Because then you can be more comfortable in monitoring. You know what to look. When you see changes, you can ring the bell early enough. Then the last thing, I'm a little bit jumping here, is to look at this agreed framework. And I read it again as a simple chemist. And I think the next 10 years, Iran, the nuclear program stays pretty much as it is, with the one exception. Iran is going to be allowed to develop much more advanced centrifuges, which in reality means if they are able to manufacture them in a big quantities, will actually cut down the breakout time. The only way to keep the breakout time there up in the 1 year is to control the imports of the essential raw materials, components, see the R&D on those centrifuges to know where they are at any point of time. But what is missing from this debate, in my view, is what about outsourcing? You can do these things somewhere else and just bring them back in time, set them up in a few weeks or few months' time, and then you have enough capacity to produce highly enriched uranium in your own soil. And if you go back to the history, you saw that those couple of times of couple of thousand of centrifuges in Fordo, where I think at the speed of setting up centrifuges was 3-4 cascades per month. So when you have these powerful ones, they will be up and running in a few months' time. Other provisions are there. So we ought to keep it in mind, and I think it's one of the most essential new provisions on this. Then you come to year 10. And I think I have to say that President Obama was very honest here. He said that, after that, the breakout time will go down in terms of the production of enriched uranium, because Iran can put any number of centrifuges. There's still a cap how much low enriched uranium can be produced. But nevertheless, it's going to be very different ball game. And then you come to year 15. Not really any restrictions for low enriched uranium. But what people have forgotten from this debate, I think to a great extent, is that the Arak research reactor, which is the other suspected route for producing material for nuclear weapon to produce plutonium, actually all the restrictions will disappear after 15 years, because yes, the Arak reactor has been modified, but there's no limitation to build any other heavy water reactor. There's entirely open field there. And then the last thing is that I would like to say that there might be a difference in understanding also in the perpetuity of this agreement, which is being negotiated. Because if you go back to the last 2-3 days, particularly Mr. Arachi and others have said that actually there's no perpetuity. So I think that it's important for us to understand when does the Iranian undertaking for not reprocessing spent fuel expires. Are they going also to send all the spent fuel out of Iran after year 20 or 25 or even 15 because of the perpetuity? So I think that I leave it here with my questions, and I would like to hear particularly what Bruno says on the left side, whether he shares my views, and I welcome any questions which you might have to this head.
Thank you very much. And let me turn to Alireza to pick up the commentary.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bloomfield. Thank you. I really like to thank the organizers for the opportunity. Been an honor to be in this very distinguished panel. And I think Dr. Heinonen addressed the more technical aspect of the nuclear weapons program of Iran and the nuclear program of Iran. And certainly, I think during the Q&A, there's a lot more opportunity to discuss that. What I'd like to address is basically the Iranian regime's point of view, where they started things, why they came to the negotiating table, what their strategy is, and what's the way forward. In one word, the reason that Supreme Leader Khamenei agreed to come to the negotiating table was basically twofold. One was the impact of the economic sanctions, both in terms of the financial sector, but also the oil. That was really devastating. But perhaps even more important than that was the issue of survival, the political consequences of the sanctions that was really hurting the regime. And Khamenei was so concerned what kind of impact it would have among the population, especially keeping in mind that back in summer of 2009, there was a huge uprising that shook the very foundation of the regime. And Khamenei was concerned that if such a thing happens again, as a result of the hardship coming with the sanctions, they may not actually survive. So that was really the reason they came to the negotiating table. It wasn't a change of heart. It wasn't a decision to abandon their nuclear weapons program or any of those things. Now, when Khamenei came to the table, in the ideal world, he really wanted to accomplish perhaps three things. One, get the sanctions lifted. I mean, all the sanctions lifted. Second, to maintain the entire nuclear infrastructure of the Iranian regime, as Dr. Heinonen mentioned. And third, to keep the secret part of the program, or the part that deals with the nuclear weaponization, the military aspect of the program. These are the ideal situations that if they are able to accomplish, as far as Tehran is concerned, it's a victory for them. This is what they really would consider as a big accomplishment. Now, what Tehran was ready to give up was basically two things. A, to provide some level of access to the known sites, only the known sites, Natanz, Arak, Fardo, a few other sites that is already known to the IAEA, and provide, maybe even enhanced access to those sites, nothing more. And basically, try to keep them away from any kind of access to the military sites. They were also ready to reduce the capacity. If they can reduce the capacity in Natanz, in Fardo, in Iraq, even that would have been acceptable to them. Now, what were the red lines? There were three basically big red lines that Khamenei had directed the negotiating team to follow. A, we're not going to accept the no enrichment, the zero enrichment. That means whether dismantlement of any of the enrichment sites or reducing the enrichment to zero. Second, no access to the secret sites, the military sites. That's basically where the secret sites are. No access to the experts and the officials who are associated with it. And third, they're not going to address what they call the PMD, the possible military dimensions, the past activities of the Iranian regime dealing with the weaponization. There are about a dozen, maybe even more, lingering questions about this that the IAEA has been pursuing for over a decade, some of them, that they're not going to basically address that. So with that in mind, look at the strategy of Tehran. Their strategy has been, if we can convince the P5+1 to get all we want, we would sign the agreement yesterday because it certainly benefits them. If not, get whatever you can and then drag it. What does dragging do? Once the regime drags the talks, they can avoid the consequences of a confrontation. They can avoid the consequences of abandoning their weaponization program. They can keep some level of hope among the population, because so long as the talks goes, that there's some kind of a lead on the population, that they're thinking, okay, maybe this issue will be resolved, the whole sanctions will be lifted, and things will change. And then it will basically put the foreign policy of foreign countries, especially the P5+1 and maybe others, in basically put it on a pause. So, and looking at the situation right now, this seems to be that, to sum up, Tehran was desperate, continues to be desperate to get a deal, or at the minimum, keep the negotiations alive. This notion that if we press too hard, Tehran will walk away from the negotiating table is not founded, is unfounded. There is no basis to support it. One of the tactics that Tehran has used, by the way, Supreme Leader Khamenei has some top advisors that are helping him on this issue. He has what is called Strategic Council of the Supreme Leader's headquarters. It was called Shoray Rahbardiyeh Nahad Rahbari, that's the Farsi name. And it's headed actually by Kamal Kharazi, the former foreign minister of the Iranian regime, who was the foreign minister under Khatami, but is now very pro-Khamenei. And it has 4 committees. One of them is the political committee headed by Saeed Jalili, who was the top nuclear negotiator of Iran. And they work and discuss these things, even though sometimes there's disagreement among them. But the general consensus is that you need to maintain the talks and keep them alive as far as you can. So having said that, where does that put us in terms of the agreement? I think, speaking about whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, I think a good deal is already out of the picture because a good deal would require no enrichment capability for Tehran, full access to all the sites and all of that. But the very fact that even the JPOA pretty much legitimized the enrichment program of Iran. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the good deal is out. So what you're left is a bad deal, a very bad deal, and maybe a horrible deal. So picking among the three options, taking the less bad one, let's put it that way, you certainly want to emphasize on what Tehran doesn't want you to do, which is snap inspections, not managed inspections, snap inspections, anywhere, any place. And definitely you want the answer to the PMD, possible multi-dimension questions. And if those answers are not provided before the agreement is signed, you will never get it, period. That has to be before any signing of the agreement, resolving all the PMD issues. And then when it comes to the issue of the sanctions, which is what Tehran badly wants, you don't want to lift the sanctions, especially definitely not the non-nuclear ones, but you don't want to lift the sanctions until Tehran is in compliance with whatever that agreement is. And it has to be based on the steps that basically they take. So that's just a sum up of what I had to share.
Very much. And now I'll turn to Director Woolsey.
Thank you. I think these talks are worse than worthless. I don't think we should be in them. I think any reasonable, predictable outcome will not be in the interests of anyone except Iran, and that Iran has a good chance of utilizing an agreement to its advantage and to hasten the day by which it becomes a nuclear power. The world in which Iran is a nuclear power, even with one weapon, is a very different world than the one we live in today. And given the nature of these talks and the way they have gone, we are headed hard toward a world in which Iran has a nuclear weapon. Yes, it may be as much as a year or so. Yes, it would not be a very sophisticated weapon, but one does not need sophistication. If a weapon is detonated on a test showing that Iran has an early stage nuclear weapon, the world changes. And I think continuing to pursue these talks is very unrealistically optimistic about Iranian behavior. They have not done anything to help us understand their previous military work, to acquiesce in what's very important, the movements of their technology and the development of their technology. They have not done anything to permit us to looking toward the future, to appear as if we're going to be able to have access to all sites, including military sites. Nothing that they have said or done in the last year or so has been of use or utility to those who want to stop their progress toward nuclear power, whether that's here in the United States or among the brave Iranian dissidents in Iran. I think that we will certainly be met by lots of taqiyya and lots of strategic maneuvering. The Persians invented chess. They are good at it. They are good at strategy and planning. And they will do everything humanly possible to get as quickly as possible to having a nuclear weapon while lying and deceiving us, their negotiating partners. I have been an advisor to one set of nuclear negotiations for the United States, a delegate to two, and then chief negotiator and ambassador to a fourth negotiation, the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe talks back in '89 to '91. I have studied arms control negotiations quite a bit, and as I said, participated in some. I have never seen anything close, even from the Soviets, to the lack of willingness to cooperate in anything that would be rational or reasonable as an ultimate agreement than this. And I think that if we continue to delude ourselves and believe that a reasonable agreement is going to be possible, we will be worse than disappointed. We will find in some months to a year or two that we wake up one morning and Iran, as a country that now has a nuclear weapon or weapons, is beginning to issue its edicts. Who will it order around next after it uses the Houthis, after it uses its control over Hezbollah, after it uses what it can orchestrate in Iraq? What will its next move be? Its next move will be bolstered by it being a nuclear power, by everyone realizing that now they have to make sure they don't offend Iran in any major way, because it will play that nuclear card very, very shrewdly. We can be, I think, quite assured of that. What can we do about it? Of course, the ideal solution is for a democratization. Many of the people in this room have a very important role in this, of Iran. And 2 years ago, when asked what ought to happen, I would generally respond, yes, that ought to be our focus. I still like it being a major focus, but we are virtually out of time. I think we are going to have to prepare to use force against Iran, against not only its nuclear capabilities, but against all capabilities of the IRGC, the Quds Force, the rest of its instruments of state power. We should do this and plan this in such a way that when we use force, we do not damage any more than absolutely essential the Iranian civilian economy or civilian infrastructure. We might begin it by doubling all sanctions that we have any responsibility for based on Iran's past lies and deceits, and move from there. Do we absolutely have to plan to use force effectively? And I think massively, yes. Do we still hope we won't have to? I'm sure you would join me in hoping yes. But hope is not a strategy.
Thank you. Let me turn to Linda Chavez.
Well, after that very sobering view, first of all, obviously, I am not a nuclear arms expert. I've spent my life mostly in politics and public policy. But what gives me, I think, some insight into what's going on is the early part of my career, where I served with the American Federation of Teachers, which is a large public employee union in the United States. And I learned something about collective bargaining during that process. When you have parties coming to the bargaining table, in order for bargaining to be successful, in order to have a successful outcome, both parties need to know what it is that is essential to their goals and what it is they are willing to give on. Now, it's very clear what Iran hopes to seek in these negotiations. The country has, in fact, been crippled by the economic sanctions. They have, in fact, worked well. And the Iranian people have suffered, and the regime, knowing the discontent among the Iranian people, hopes to lift the sanctions in order to basically keep a lid on what is a possibly explosive situation in that country. So they hope to gain out of these negotiations some time. I think Director Woolsey is correct, and others on the panel are correct, that their real intention is not, certainly not to dismantle their program, perhaps to delay it, or at least delay it in such a way that work is going on in other places that will allow them to break out in a short period of time. But their goals are clear. What is unclear to me is what the United States goals are and what it is that President Obama seeks to gain with this. Well, maybe I'm being a little dishonest in that. I think it actually is pretty clear what he seeks to gain in it. This is not about stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon. It may have started out that way. I think when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, when he was still a candidate, he believed that on the force of his personality and intelligence, that if he simply sat down with, at the time, Ahmadinejad, Fidel Castro, and Kim Jong-il, that he would persuade them to change their evil ways and to simply cooperate with the rest of the world. I mean, he talked about it. He talked about, I want to engage in direct conversations. I think this is this is the way we ought to proceed. Well, obviously that didn't happen, and he was elected president, and in 2009, as Alireza has talked about already, we had street protests in Iran. The people of Iran, fed up with the regime, with the brutality and the deprivation caused by the regime, took to the streets. And as I don't need to tell anybody in this room, all you had to do is turn on television. The signs in the streets, many of them were in English. Many of them were appealing to President Obama to support democracy in Iran. But he turned a blind eye to that. Fast forward several years, and the Obama administration, which President Obama himself, who started out with high hopes of changing the world, transforming the world into a better place, bringing peace and prosperity to his own country, peace throughout the world, finds himself, frankly, in a much more dangerous world than he inherited. And we now have a threat in the Middle East, turmoil in a variety of countries. Yemen, which less than a year ago President Obama described as a success story in our counter-terrorism strategy, is now, because of the influence of Iran, because of the help of Iran with the Houthis, has in fact collapsed. We see that after the blood and treasure that was spent in Iraq, when American forces were able to bring a degree of stability, remove a brutal dictator, and bring a degree of stability to that country, once the Obama administration essentially said, we're taking the troops out, we don't have a status of forces agreement, and what comes will come. Well, we know what's come. What's come is the Islamic State and huge incursions and huge threats to the stability of Iraq. Well, now we are in the middle of negotiations with Iran on a nuclear treaty, and the president has a major problem in the region, and particularly in Iraq, with Islamic State. He's not willing to commit U.S. troops to go and to try to bring stability to that country. So where does he turn? Where does he allow the Iraqis to turn? To Iran. And so now we, I think, are faced with a situation where what the president has to get out of these negotiations, and why I think the administration is going as easy as they are, is giving up much more than they need to give up, is in the hopes that Iran will pull our irons out of the fire in Iraq. And I think this is an extraordinarily dangerous situation because as big a threat as the Islamic State is, in my view, and again, I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that we have a history of 35 years of experience with the state of Iran as the major state sponsor of terrorism throughout the world, having targeted more Westerners, more Americans than any other major terrorist threat. So the idea that in the negotiations that take place in Switzerland, we are going to make concessions, I think in part to hope that we're going to be able to stave off the situation in Iraq is, I think, terribly, terribly dangerous. I think President Obama is also looking at the end of his tenure. He's looking at his 8 years in office. He has one accomplishment to his name. Some of us on my side of the political aisle don't think of it as much of an accomplishment, but he certainly is proud of it, and that is, of course, Obamacare, health care insurance for American citizens that the president pushed through. He has nothing to show in the foreign policy arena, absolutely nothing. He came into office with many people, certainly elites in the United States, and I think in Western capitals around the world, looking for a new day of, this very smart, engaging, charming new face to somehow bolster the image of the United States abroad. Well, the image of the United States today is much worse than when President Obama took office. But I believe that he thinks that if he can take home a nuclear deal with Iran, he will have that to balance the scale in terms of what his accomplishments are. Meanwhile, in doing this, he has made the world a much more dangerous place. Not just because of what's happening in places like Iran and Iraq and Yemen, but there is no question that once it is clear that Iran will have a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons, this will not be a non-proliferation treaty. This will be a proliferation treaty. It will be an open invitation to others in the region to pursue nuclear weapons. I see no way that that can possibly stop. So I look at this from a more political point of view. I look at it from the point of view of somebody who's been involved in a different kind of negotiations. But I look at the United States as not the superpower in the world, but the United States in a position of tremendous weakness when we sit at that bargaining table. And I think as a result, the world that we are entering is going to be much more dangerous than the one we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you. We've heard one Iranian perspective, one international organizational perspective, and a lot of American views. Now for a French view from Mr. Tertrais.
Thank you. I'm going to start where Mrs. Chavez left it. I actually don't think that President Obama believes that he absolutely needs a nuclear deal for his legacy. If you take it from his standpoint, or rather from what I think is his standpoint and that of his advisor, and we all know some of his advisors. I promised withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan, checked. I killed Osama bin Laden, check. I've made a historic step towards Cuba, check. Do I really need more in terms of international legacy? I'm not sure that he thinks so. However, and that's where the problem comes, I believe the Iranians believes he needs a deal badly, and I do think that at least some of his very close advisors, and probably himself, believes that a deal with Iran will help him better manage the current chaos in the Middle East. Again, it's like deterrence, it's like most negotiations. What matters is not so much what you think, but what the other guy in front of you thinks that you think. And I think we're in a pretty bad place. I think we all agree that we're not going to have what any reasonable observer would consider a good deal. However, and that's my first point, I'm not sure yet that there will be a deal, a joint comprehensive plan of action by this summer. Look, if you look at actually what has really been agreed, it's only half a page. It's the EU-Iran joint statement. All the rest, it's still up in the air. Remember that the negotiators, at least on paper, have agreed to a fundamental principle, which is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That means that even on issues that the White House has publicized as major breakthroughs, the Iranians can still say, no, we have not agreed to anything. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So you look at the EU-Iran joint statement, the only existing agreement at this point, what you're left is with a very vague declaration of principles. Let me make a comparison. Many people in this room will be familiar with the history of the Middle East peace process. It's the equivalent of the Clinton parameters, okay? It's the equivalent of saying, oh, you have the Clinton parameters, peace is at hand, you know? Or to say, well, it's a good framework for discussion. Doesn't bring you closer to satisfactory settlement of the Palestinian issue? Not at all. So it's just a reminder that we're not there yet. It's going to be up to the finish. It's really almost funny the way the United States has, is trying to correct from its previous mistakes of giving the impression that it needs the deal more than the Iranians needs a deal. Wendy Sherman, the political director of the State Department, says, oh, I'm flying out of Geneva on July the 1st. She said that very publicly. Okay, so it's kind of, I respect her for other reasons, but that's not the best and the smartest way to strategize. My view, and I'll get back to this in a second, is that we should, if there is no deal on June the 31st, we should just say goodbye. Goodbye, no deal. And then the real game begins. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what we're going to do. My second point is that assuming there is a final deal, 35 years of past Iranian behavior show us that it is highly likely that Iran will try to test the international community, will try to cheat. Whatever its plans, it will want to probe us and to see what the American reactions are. That will happen. Even assuming, and that's a big if, even assuming that this regime believes that it has an interest in at least appearing to abide by the agreement for the next 10 years. So what happens next? The problem, and that has been said before, the problem is that the credibility as a deterrent of the use of force right now is dead. It does not exist anymore, at least the American one. I don't know whether the next American president will restore the credibility of the military option as a deterrent. I hope he or she will, because even though I am not in favor of using force right now against Iran, I do think that having as a deterrent a credible, and credible means that the other side believes you, a credible threat of military action is a very important component of the management of this crisis, and one which is unfortunately sorely lacking right now. So what happens then? If Iran tests the international community, and if Iran is undeterred, what happens? It could get pretty bad. I mean, it's bad today. It could get much worse. It could go North Korea. It could go Iraq. Okay? And I don't need to tell you that these are not good scenarios. My third point is to say that even if you assume that there is a final deal over the summer, and if you assume, that's two big ifs, if you assume that the deal is faithfully implemented by Iran, it will leave Iran and maybe others around the world, not only in the region, as with a significant, quote, breakout capability. Iran will be, by any reasonable definition, I don't know what my friend Olli's definition is of a threshold state, but by any reasonable definition, Iran will be a threshold state after what we think could be the deal. So the P5+1, the EU 3+3, after 10, 12, 13 years, will have made Iran a legitimate nuclear hedger, able to build the bomb within an even shorter period of time than is the case right now. What a success. Now, some of my friends in the EU 3+3 community tell me, look, 10 years, 12 years, it's not so bad. Time is a precious commodity in international diplomacy. Now, all of us with experience in government know that it is a precious community. But frankly, by the standards of nuclear programs, 10 years is nothing. By the standards of the Islamic Republic of Iran, 10 years is not much. So I would say, what a success. You've been negotiating for more than 10 years now, and now all you're able to give us is that additional period of 10 years. I can't say that I will be able to congratulate my French government colleagues if the deal is what it seems what it could be. But not only that, let me make it a story. An Iranian and a Saudi walk into a bar. The Iranian orders something. The Saudi can't hear what the Iranian has ordered, but the Saudi says, "I'll have the same thing." Now, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. The Saudis have made it very clear that they will have whatever Iran gets, okay? So this means that, and they've said it not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 or 5 times very publicly. That means it will be very difficult for Saudi Arabia to walk back, okay? So even though I do not believe for a second that Saudi Arabia is willing and able to make the bomb quickly, that's nonsense. Sometimes international security experts will claim that there will be an immediate cascade of proliferation in the Middle East. That is not true, okay? But they have options, and they have money, and they have time. If you have time, options, and money, you can do it, okay? So believing that Saudi Arabia will remain idle and that nothing will happen after the deal, from my point of view, is nonsense. Finally, but maybe my friend Olli wants to discuss that, he knows these things better than I do, there is a credibility problem for the non-proliferation regime, because the elephant in the room is the so-called possible military dimensions. I don't know why we still call them possible. The PMD. And that's not being negotiated. That's a separate negotiation track. The problem is that our EU 3+3 colleagues appear ready to put that under the carpet, so to say. And that's a problem. And again, Olli Heinonen is better placed than anybody else here to tell us why it is a problem for the overall credibility of the non-proliferation regime and for the atomic, the IAEA. Finally, and very quickly, even assuming that there is a deal, that Iran faithfully implements it, there is little evidence that what I think the Barack Obama calculus is, that it's going to be a game changer in the region. There is little evidence of that. On the contrary, but I think many in this room are better placed than I am to discuss that, I think there are good grounds to believe that this could lead actually to a more conservatism and even more radicalization of the regime, because the last thing this regime wants to do is to appear as having given up on what it at the core, at the roots of its political DNA. So the last thing that Khamenei wants to do, I suppose, is to give the impression that the pragmatists have won over the hardliners. So even that hypothetical benefit, I think, will not happen. And I'm very surprised, very sorry, and very troubled by some of the conversations that I've had with some advisors, some smart people. That's the problem. There are smart people around Barack Obama. When smart people like that have made political calculations that are just pipe dreams, then I think the world is really in trouble.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a good description of criticisms of what we're seeing, the standards that should be pursued, the implications of what might happen, something about each of the players, including the European component. I've built my career by asking dumb questions and being not only not the smartest person in the room, but believing that everyone in the room can teach you something. And as temporarily a special envoy, I had the simple task of trying to separate shoulder-fired missiles from warlords and countries that, for whom that might have been their most sexy weapon. And so the questions that were simple to me were, who can say yes? What could I do for them that would get them to yes? How do I do this pretty much in one meeting, since you have a global portfolio and can't be drawn back again and again without a yes answer? And I must confess to you, and I wrote this the other night in an article in the National Interest, I haven't understood what I'm looking at in these negotiations. I want to pose this question to the panel. What have we just been watching for the last 2 years? We would come to a deadline, the Iranians would come out smiling, saying, we had very productive talks, but their aides would say on background, we didn't agree to anything, and we'd keep going. And meanwhile, the region was lit on fire. And it led me to the question in this piece that I wrote as to, is it possible that neither party was serious about either getting sanctions comprehensively lifted, which could only be done by going to Congress and lifting the sanctions and to the UN, and removing the nuclear program, an act of statehood that could only be taken by the supreme leader as an act of victory, an act of state, not as losing an arm wrestling contest to a superior Western power. And so I ask again, was this ever about getting the sanctions lifted? Was it ever about stopping Iran's nuclear power? Insofar as, in my view, the two parties that could actually make the deal, Congress and the supreme leader, were external to the process. That may be an oversimplification, but that's my specialty. So I invite the panel to the next round of comments. Who would like to speak first? Sir, Olli.
Yeah. Well, I have seen this negotiation going on last 12, 13 years, since August 2002, yeah, when the problem came. Thanks to you on my tape. And I have asked the same question, what we really want out here? And there has been very many aspirations on all sides during this process. But this is the basic question, you know. I look at Olli, as I said, I'm just a simple chemist from Brookline, but you know, when I look at the nuclear program of Iran today, 5,000, 6,000 centrifuges, I'm doing R&D. It's much too big number. You need maybe a couple of hundred at most if you want to do R&D. If you want to produce fuel for a pusher power plant, maybe I agree with my old friend Ambassador Saleh. You know, you need 120, 130,000 of those. It doesn't make economical sense, but if you want to do it, that's what you need. So where does this 6,000 fit? It doesn't fit anywhere. Other than there's some other reason to have those. And I think that this is the difficult thing to admit. And I think that these negotiators who are there, if you go back 2 weeks ago and you go to the ISIS website of David Albright when they talk about the capacities of the centrifuges. So the US negotiators said that in their negotiations, one centrifuge has capacity of one separative work unit. The Iranians said that no, it has 0.6. That's why we want to have a big number. Fine. But when I look at that one, it has no technical rationality. This is a bargaining. It's a bargaining of buying a thing or selling a thing. It has no reality. For me, there's no vision, what the other party wants to do other than accommodate the wish of the other. And then to make it worse, the Iranian negotiators, according to Mr. Albright, say that it's 0.6. Then the US government says it's 1. But turn the clock to, I think it was August last year, when my friend Ambassador Saleh, he was very frank. He says actually the capacity is 1.3. That's what he claims. So what we are talking here, one guy says it's 0.6, one guy says it's 1, one guy says it's in 0.3. Where is the reality check here? Because if you have 1.3, it's 2 times more than what the other one. So this takes me back to this basic, I would say, I don't say fallacy, but the misunderstanding of this breakout time. It really doesn't make sense in the way it's being presented. And this goes back to the questions you raised. What's the purpose of these talks? Face saving? Or really, actually, Iran to have a nuclear program which is meeting its practical needs, is solely for peaceful purposes, in such a way that we don't see similar things happening in the Middle East. And as Bruno said, it's not 1 time, it's not 2 times, it's not 3 times. But again, look the window last 1 year. Nuclear cooperation agreements between the Gulf states and let's expand it to Turkey and Egypt. All these nuclear cooperation agreements have one common factor. It's about to do with the nuclear technology, not about the nuclear power plants. So they are looking fuel fabrication, they are looking uranium conversion, they are looking this front end of the fuel cycle. I come from a very simple, small country, which is Finland. Yes, we had those aspirations in 1960s, 1970s, to have our own fuel cycle. Now there are 4 nuclear power plants in Finland, no front-end fuel cycle. Neighboring Sweden has about 10 nuclear reactors, no front-end fuel cycle. You take Ukraine, dozen reactors, no front-end fuel cycle. There has been some talks about the nuclear fuel fabrication, but never enrichment. And these are the guys and countries which live from the energy. Their industry depends on the energy, imported energy, not just energy, because none of them have domestic big energy resources anymore, and compare it to Iran. So I think these are the things which I think this P5+1, and I agree fully with Bruno, should be addressed and call the thing with the real name and talk about it.
Yes. Responding to your question, Ambassador Bloomfield, I think if you look at the whole program, the negotiations didn't start, the whole program didn't start when the negotiations started 2-3 years ago. The program dates back to the mid-'80s. And the whole nuclear weapons program of Iran was initiated by the military part of the country, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. When the AQ Khan network was exposed, all the connections showed up between the AQ Khan and the meetings he had in Tehran with commanders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards who were running the show, running the program. And this whole nuclear infrastructure of Iran was created by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, was maintained and continued and expanded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And as we speak right now, the entire program is run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. One of the reasons that the IAEA, and I think Olli can elaborate more, that is interested to speak to and interview Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a Brigadier General of the Revolutionary Guards, is because of his expanded role he has had over the years, and he has right now in heading an organization called SEPAND, which is the organization that was formed in July of 2011, and in February 2011, exposed by the NCRI in July 2011, that oversees all of the nuclear activities of the Iranian regime, controlled by the Revolutionary Guards and reported to the Revolutionary Guards and the Ministry of Defense. All of the sites that Tehran doesn't want the IAEA to inspect almost all of them are military sites. It's not an accident. What about Parchin? Why is Tehran playing games since 2005? I believe that was the last time the IAEA went there. It's 10 years, and they've been dragging this, over and over. A whole host of suspect nuclear sites are actually in the military installations for two reasons. One is they're run by the Revolutionary Guard, so it gives them a lot better access and ability to operate them, but also gives them a good excuse to cover them, not to allow them saying military size of limits. Dr. Heinonen talked about the R&D. Even during the nuclear talks, Tehran was actually cheating, and they were testing, feeding some of these advanced centrifuge machines. And then when they were caught, not by the P5+1, but some others, outsiders, then Tehran said, okay, well, we didn't really know exactly that's what we're not supposed to do, so it was just a mistake, and we corrected. The advanced centrifuge machines that Dr. Heinonen is talking about, some of them are 5, 10 times, 20 times more productive. So you need a lot less number of centrifuges, to get as much fissile material as you want. And the fact that Tehran is so insistent on disallowing the IAEA to visit those suspect sites has no other reason but that the fact that they want to maintain their hidden program. What you see in Natanz, Arak, and Fardo and all of the places is not the entire program of Iran. By the way, none of them were fessed up by Tehran. Almost all of them, a good number of them at least, were exposed by the Iranian opposition, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And, Secretary Kerry appeared before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he said, we want to block all pathway to the bomb by the Iran regime. And he said there are 4 pathways to the bomb, 2 of them through enrichment in Natanz and Fardo, 1 through plutonium in Iraq, he said. And he said the 4th path, which is more difficult to block, is the covert operations of the Iran regime. That's the key part that is missing. If that's the more difficult part of the thing, there is absolutely nothing that you can see in the agreement or the framework agreement that really addresses the issue of the covert operations, except to some extent, not all, the issue of the access to all the sites in Iran. And that is already off limits. So what's the problem? Assume that the Iran regime really has a genuine, serious, sincere nuclear energy program. Why would you take the whole country, all the sanctions, all the trouble, all the confrontation in the world that they've been facing just for something that is for peaceful purposes? And the world is already ready to give it to them. It's already given to them already. So a reasonable person, even if you didn't have any access to all the intelligence about the nuclear program of Iran, a reasonable person would make no other conclusion but that this is purely a nuclear weapons program run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and what Tehran wants to do, they want to keep it. They want to maintain this nuclear weapons program and at the same time get the benefit of the negotiations. I can't think of any instances in the past 35 years that the Iranian regime has been forced to take some steps through negotiations. I can't think of any of them. So why would we think that these negotiations would produce a different result? The whole purpose for them is to gain out of it their own purposes, to maintain the program, to lift the sanctions, and keep the secret program intact. And that's why it's so crucial not to kid ourselves and not to say, let's hope that this is not going to happen. This regime is intent. As we speak right now, the Supreme Leader Khamenei has decided to maintain the nuclear weapons program of Iran. Period. And that explains all the behavior that the Iran regime is doing. So for that purpose, I think I agree with Ambassador Woolsey and some others who who expressed their points of views about this, that really I can't think of any way, any solution that under this regime, with this leadership of the mullahs, you would get to a point that they would basically abandon the nuclear weapons program of Iran. The solution really lies in the change of this regime. And this is actually implicitly acknowledged when they say, okay, well, as Olli said, in 10, 15 years, Iran would not only be a threshold state, but they are in the position to have a much more advanced and a faster, perhaps a very limited breakout capability. What does that mean? And when you ask them, they say, well, in 10, 15 years, maybe things will change. Maybe Iran would be a different Iran. So are they saying that they are counting that Iran would be led by different people, and that's how you're making the deal? Well, if that's the case, then you have to work for making that happen. It's not going to happen by itself. And you have to craft a policy that would help that. You don't have to change the regime for the Iranian people. The Iranian people have already decided. But the policies that are being pursued is not helping that. It's to the country, as Ms. Chavez said, is counterproductive. The policy in Iraq, for instance, allowing the Iranian regime, the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, to run the network there and have the benefit of U.S. In a de facto way endorsing their operations in Iraq is counterproductive. It further emboldens the Iranian regime. It doesn't help the nuclear program. It further solidifies the position of the mullahs because they feel the United States need them. Actually, Javad Zarif very bluntly said that because we're helping with fighting ISIS, which they're not actually, in fact, they're helping themselves, we need to get a better cooperation with from the United States on the nuclear issue. What does that mean? He's saying give us more concessions because we're involved in Iraq. So look at the situation in Syria. Look at the situation everywhere else. So if you really want to see a productive policy, the policies has to be crafted in a way that would overlap with the desire of the Iranian people who are seeking change, democratic change in Iran. Anything short of that would be counterproductive.
Thank you. We will be talking about the regional activities of Iran in the second panel, but I want to ask Director Woolsey and others this question. We've heard about what's wrong at the table. We've heard about how this is going badly, some of the distortions of understanding. I want to ask a little bit about the intelligence community. When Henry Kissinger was negotiating Middle East peace, he had a very large intelligence team working for him, including geographers, so that when people pointed to places on the map, he knew where the hills were, he knew where the rivers were, he knew more than they did. And he called them out whenever the Americans were being fooled at the table. In Washington today, there are desk officers in the intelligence community and the policy community who focus on one thing. So when we have a think tank debate about the Iran nuclear negotiations, everyone wants to talk about centrifuges. Nobody wants to talk about Quds Force. You never hear about Soleimani. You never hear about the Houthis or the money. And so my question is this. Is the intelligence community capable of, and is it performing, or could it perform the task of serving up to the negotiators and to the policy people behind them, and in Europe, the full spectrum of all the things you've just been talking about, the real motives? How much money does the regime have? Are they hurting from the sanctions, or is it just the people? How is the information space being played inside Iran? What do we know about public sentiment inside the country? And the intentions of the supreme leader, et cetera, and what they want at the negotiations. Where is the intelligence community on this?
Well, the intelligence community is, I think, ready, and probably is continuing to now, supply experts on substance and to take direction in terms of what subjects need to be addressed. They're not ready, if they are still doing what they ought to be doing, and I think they are, they're not ready to take direction on substance, to take direction on what they ought to say. That's verboten. That's not doing your job. That's being a shill for the executive branch. No. But in terms of having the expertise to look at individual steps or to look at the system as a whole, which sometimes obviously one has to, I think, yes, I think the U.S. intelligence community is pretty well structured today to do that. But they are, I hope, not becoming well structured to give the president the answer he wants, whether or not it's supported by the intelligence and data. Let me add, if I could just add one thing on the previous discussion. It's inarticulated, but a lot of people think that Iran's interest in nuclear power, at least to some extent, may be driven by their interest in nuclear power for energy. My own view is that that is a total and complete lie. All you need to do is look at the costs of a new power plant, a new nuclear power plant, and that of a new gas-fired power plant. The United States the market, has not built a new nuclear plant for, I think, 40 years. Anything that's been built has been heavily subsidized by the government. Natural gas is so cheap these days that, well, unless you're getting a break on your uranium from the Russians who now own it, familiar with that little move? Ask me about it afterwards if you're interested in talking about it. But since the Russians now own a fair chunk of our uranium, maybe they would give nuclear power plants a bit of a cut. But barring that rather silly hypothesis, it is cheaper, way cheaper in terms of capital expenditure and considerably cheaper in terms of running the plant to build a simple, straightforward, clean natural gas plant right now. And Iran's gas reserves are stunning. Oil too, but their natural gas reserves are in the world leadership. They're in the top 2 anyway, or 3. And it is just, you really have to force yourself, I would think, even if you were an Iranian diplomat, to maintain a straight face when you tell someone that Iran is interested in nuclear power for energy production and nuclear power plants.
I agree with a lot of what Director Woolsey said. Can I respectfully tell him that this is not the best argument? Why? You know, someone for whom I have little respect for other reasons, but former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said about nuclear power plants that it's a question of prestige. He was not talking about Iran. He was saying that many countries want to have one, just like someone wants a Porsche or a Jaguar or a Rolls-Royce. Like you tell a friend, you don't need it. You can't afford that car. You don't need it. It's like, yeah, but I really want it. It looks good. And I think that to some extent, that line of reasoning does exist. So I would just say it's not that I disagree with you on substance, that may not be the best argument. We have so many good arguments to say that we know they have military intention, that this maybe not the best. 2 very quick points. First of all, with respect to the previous question that you raised, history is not going to be very kind towards the EU 3+3. At some point, you know, I look at this issue every 3 to 6 months, and then one day I thought, gee, when did we I didn't see it coming, but suddenly, at some point, I thought, we went from rollback to containment. And if you try to reconstruct the history of the EU 3+3 Iran negotiation, realize, when did that happen? I didn't see it. And then you say, oh yeah, it may have happened at the start of the discussions in Oman, which involved, by the way, very smart American people, American diplomats. Yeah, they're smart people that I know. Again, it's actually worse when they're smart. It's actually worse. And at some point, and you know, my own country engaged in damage limitation, but there's not much you can do on your own, okay? I mean, if the UK, Germany, Russia, China are not ready to support you, and you know, it's 1 against the other 6, 5 plus Iran. So it's not easy. But I think it is important to realize that the initial goals of the negotiation on the nuclear file were rollback. Leave Iran with a strictly civilian program. But now we are, we contain. We don't roll back, we contain. Finally, on the question that you raised, if I can use an example from my own country, there are benefits of being a smaller country. People in the intelligence services and in the administration have smaller portfolios, so they have to look at a slightly bigger picture. Even experts, my colleague Fred here and myself, we are generalists of geopolitics. We look at, I'm not an expert on Iran. I know a lot of things about nuclear, but I'm not an expert on Iran. But, looking at Iran, looking at the nuclear file through a broader regional prism is always important. Whenever things start again in Lausanne and Geneva, I ask myself, where is General Soleimani? Because, and that's another important point, I would finish by this, the reasons why these negotiations happen is that they are officially separated from the rest of the regional situation, whereas in fact, in the mindset of the two most important participants, that is Iran and the US, the regional context is constantly in their mind. So there's a paradox here. Officially, it's completely separated, and that's the reason why they exist. But in fact, indeed, we should never lose sight of the broader regional situation because it's very much in the mindset of the negotiators, even if they don't say it publicly.
Well, I appreciate your linking the two because that will be a nice segue for the second panel. Linda, did you have another comment before we take questions from the floor? All right. We're short of time. We've really had a rich discussion, but I'm going to ask you to identify yourself. Are there microphones, or do people speak up loudly? There are microphones, so if we could bring those forward. The gentleman in the second row, please. Just wait for the microphone and identify yourself. There we go. Sir?
Thank you very much. My name is Pervis Solgi-Kazai, a former ambassador. I defected my embassy in Sweden and Norway and joined the National Council of Resistance some years ago. 2 points from Madame in the panel and also Monsieur encouraged me to also give a very short comment on these 2 right points. The first thing was that the administration thinks that coming close to Cuba or to Iran and to Korea, that will be conducive to a better world and more moderate and more reasonable world, and that is wrong. Because with Cuba it's different, because Cuba is toothless after this, the Cold War, and then the threat of the Soviet Union. There is a brother, Cuba has Venezuela, which at least keeps the tempo of anti-Americanism, but this is just a sort of rhetoric. But when it comes to Korea and Iran, it is different. It is different because that encouraged them really to be emboldened. Why? Then I come to the second point of our panelist, and I give the and I think there is a move in the administration, and also some lobbyists of the regime. I have been in a conference with them in Oslo the day before yesterday, and they say that if Iran reach an agreement with the West, the situation with human rights will be better and will be more reasonable country in the region, and that's proved very much wrong, because I just gave to them the example of Libya. Remember that Gaddafi relinquished all his nuclear power and then gave it up. But did he become moderate? Did he make a more democratic process? No. On the contrary, he was more emboldened. He was more aggressive against his own people until and unless the people they rose against him and toppled him. And my second point it was from the gentleman from France. This credibility of deterrence. I agree with you that if you want to keep a credibility of a deterrence, you have to show power. You have to show your teeth, your muscles. And The great Bismarck said one day that to negotiate with a counterpart without showing your muscles and military muscles, it is just staging a concert, a chamber of orchestra without instruments. And also Sadi, the Iranian poet, said a very beautiful word on it. He says, if you want to really lead to some negotiation with your enemy or counterpart, you have to rattle your sable before, and then keep the door open for the negotiation. Here we see people, you know, the administration is rattling, but rattling without a sable. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. Let's get another question.
One sentence.
I'm sorry, please, Jim.
On a very, very small point, a gentleman I call Tsar Vladimir the Bare-Breasted is really taken your words about showing muscles to heart.
Indeed. So we have a gentleman about 4 rows back on the right side. If we could get the microphone, please. Identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Sharif Vakili. I'm just a medical student at Hopkins. This question is for anyone, but in particular Director Woolsey, because I think there are few people on this planet who have as much knowledge and experience in strategy. But it actually has to do with strategy and the reason for these negotiations. About 2 months ago, New York Times reporter Thomas Friedman spoke with Obama and coined this term called the Obama Doctrine, where Obama was essentially explaining that the reason why he's going to these negotiations is to test it out and not relinquish any possibilities, and basically do it because there's nothing to lose and to gain legitimacy. My question is, in the context that, my question is that, could these negotiations have value in respect that when they snap back, which is the expression you had used, they can snap back even harder with more legitimacy and with more public support after, and we know the Iranian administration won't follow what they claim, but after they embarrass themselves, would we be able to then use more of an international platform to say, to legitimize something stronger by saying, look, they aren't behaving, and we tried negotiations, we tried something diplomatic, but instead of just going ahead and starting with force?
I think that the first problem the Obama administration has on strategy is that I think you always ought to start thinking about a strategic situation by somewhere near the very early part of your thinking, putting yourself in your opponent's shoes and doing the best planning you can for him. I must say I got that idea from my father when I was 8 years old. He was a career litigator, and he always prepared his opponent's case before he prepared his own. And it is, I think, crucial to get inside the head of the mullahs and try to figure out what they're trying to accomplish, what they'll do in order to accomplish it, what limitations, if any, there are on them, and so forth. And I think once you get there, it's kind of a scary place, but I think once you get there, you end up realizing how duplicitous and how ruthless they can and will be. They are operating under the assumption that they are doing the divine will and that you are the devil. And there is no sense of the need to be honorable or truthful in talking with us or dealing in that fashion at all. It is absent. And only if you sit there quietly as you begin to study something, put yourself in your enemy's shoes, think like he does, and then figure out what maybe should we start thinking about to do in response to that. I think that's a very important part of the planning that I have not seen the Obama administration, let me put it gently, excel at.
All right. We're running a little over time, but one more question. Could we bring the microphone to the front row, please, for this gentleman?
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Gilbert. I'm the former Albanian ambassador to the US. And prior to that, I was ambassador to the Atomic Agency. And I happened to work in the same time with Olli and Greg Schulte as well, whom you know, I think. I believe in diplomacy, since I'm a diplomat, and I believe in agreements. But there is a toolbox for that. And the main tool in that toolbox is the so-called carrot and stick approach. And I believe replacing the stick with a smaller carrot, it hurts. Because on the other side, everybody can be pleased with a smaller carrot. And here we are talking about the elephant in the room, which is the military dimension of the Iranian nuclear program. Japan has an interesting nuclear program, highly developed. Nobody doubts that, because they have committed themselves to NPT, transparency, and whatever. So the key word here is transparency. Why Iran doesn't sign and be committed to the NPT? And this is a question for Olli, maybe, what he thinks about that. As I said, I come from Albania, which has experienced dictatorship for 50 years. Believe me, 25 years later, after the fall of communism in 1982, we still get surprises. Find a tunnel with 50 Chinese tanks 25 years later. So my word is, don't expect and don't hope for transparency from a dictatorial regime, because it's not in its nature. It cannot happen. So I think the bigger elephant in the room is not the military dimension of the Iranian nuclear program, but is the dictatorial regime itself in Iran. So this is the cause of everything. This is the cause of every evil thing. And I come back to that question. So do you really believe that Iran can accept NPT so that it can be committed to that? Thank you.
Before we hear an answer to that question from Ambassador from Albania, which of course was a very ruthless dictatorship, but turned into a very generous government who has shown hospitality to the residents of Camp Liberty. And so I want to thank you publicly, Mr. Ambassador, for that. So bad governments can turn into good governments. Do you think it'll happen in Iran? Anyone?
Not about the government, but about the non-proliferation undertaking. You can imagine, Mr. Ambassador, how often, Your Excellency, I hear this question that, what about the Japanese plutonium? What about the Japanese enrichment? What about the Brazilian? But they always forget about the Netherlands and Germany when they raise this issue. And my answer is very, very simple. I say, look, Japan is in compliance with its non-proliferation undertakings. Sure, you can never say that's forever, but they are. And that's the difference, because if we take back, last unfortunate couple of decades, Iran has not met that standard. And I think the answer is there. And then just to add to Director Woolsey, it's also the rationality of the nuclear program. One of my friend Saleh's statement was that this is for energy independence. Energy independence. I'm a wicked person, I'm a chemist, so I look certainly chemicals, and I look uranium. So the current holdings of uranium in Iranian soil, based on their own numbers, are enough. If you extract all that uranium from Iran, is enough to fuel one reactor in Bushehr for 5 years. I don't think you are overly independent if you can only guarantee one reactor for 5 years. Because, the nation is to survive decades and plans to have much more nuclear power. So I think we should keep this in mind, and I recommend you to read, to the extent available, are the documents from summer 2003, when there was a debate in the Iranian parliament about the nuclear program. So I think that there are certain things to learn there if these documents are translated in public.
Director, you had one more comment?
Just one comment about Albania and can the Iranians learn. I think the answer depends in no small measure upon the degree to which we might persuade them to read some Madison. Because we've done a lot of things wrong in American history. We had slavery, we've done a lot of things wrong. But one thing we did right was set up a constitution that put the different parts of the government at odds with one another in order to prevent dictatorship. And we've succeeded phenomenally, and a great deal of the other things that have gone right with the United States derive from that. That's a hard thing for a country newly free, I think, to get its mind around, because you get the idea that everything ought to be perfect and wonderful and rosy, and some of our friends in Eastern Europe kind of drifted that way in the aftermath of the fall of the wall. But if you can get them into the mode of thinking, look, we don't have a huge objective here. It's not perfection. It's not a rosy world. We want to set things up in such a way that nobody can take over, nobody can be a dictator. We got to persuade one another of where to go, and the government structure has to do that. I think we would have done a very fine thing for Albanians and Iranians and others.
With that, let me ask you to thank our panelists, and I'm going to ask the other panel to take the stage. Thank you both very much.